If you close that door, do not expect me to be here when it opens." Claire Bennett barely recognized her own voice. It was too calm for a woman watching 7 years of hope disappear beneath the golden lights of Blackwood Palace. 30 feet down the royal corridor, Ethan Blackwood stopped with one hand resting on the carved door of his private suite. Beside him stood Madeleine Hayes, the alpha woman the council had named Luna less than 2 hours earlier. Her ivory ceremonial gown caught the moonlight pouring through the tall windows, while Ethan still wore the black coat and silver insignia of the Alpha King. He turned toward Claire. For one suspended heartbeat, the palace seemed to hold its breath. Claire. Her name sounded like a warning and a plea at once. Claire touched the silver moon pendant at her throat, the one Ethan had given her 5 winters ago when he promised there would always be one place in his life where she would never have to question whether she belonged. She had believed him. That was the part that hurt most. Madeleine looked between them, confusion slowly giving way to understanding. "Perhaps I should leave," she said quietly. "No." Claire removed the pendant before Ethan could answer. "You were chosen tonight. You have done nothing wrong by standing where they asked you to stand." Ethan stepped away from the door. "This is not what you think." Claire almost laughed, but the sound never came. "Then what should I think?" "There are things I need to explain." "You had weeks." His expression tightened. Claire knew that look. She had seen it during council crises, trade disputes, and every impossible decision since he inherited the crown. Usually she was the person who stayed after everyone else left. Tonight, she finally understood how easily loyalty could become something another person expected instead of treasured. Ethan glanced toward Madeleine, then back at Claire. "The kingdom needs this alliance." "I know. Nothing between us has to change." Those words settled more heavily than any accusation could have. Claire stared at him. "That is exactly the problem." Ethan took another step toward her. She lifted one hand, stopping him without touching him. "You chose what the kingdom needed. Then you decided what I would be willing to live with. I was trying to protect you. You never asked whether I wanted protection." Silence filled the corridor. Claire placed the pendant on a narrow marble table beneath the window. Ethan looked at it, as if she had set down something far heavier. "Claire, wait." She met his silver-gray eyes one last time. "I have been waiting for years." Then she turned and walked away. Ethan did not follow. Before dawn, Claire packed one blue dress, $43 in savings, her mother's photograph, and a worn notebook filled with addresses of people she had helped across the kingdom. She returned her palace keys to the night steward and left through the eastern servants' gate, while Blackwood Palace slept beneath the fading moon. At 7 that morning, Ethan knocked on her door. No answer came. He opened it and found a neatly made bed, an empty closet, and a single sheet of paper on the table. "You made your choice. I am finally making mine." Ethan read the sentence twice. Then his eyes fell on the silver pendant beside it. And for the first time since becoming Alpha King, he understood that there were some things a crown could lose that no command could bring back. Ethan remained in Claire's room long after the palace bells announced 8 o'clock. Morning light spilled across the wooden floor, touching the few things she had left behind, and somehow the emptiness felt more personal than anger would have. Claire had not broken anything. She had not demanded an audience or embarrassed him before the council. She had simply removed herself from a life in which he had expected her to remain. Ethan picked up the silver pendant and closed his fingers around it. 7 years earlier, before the crown belonged to him, Claire had been a newly hired Omega carrying correspondence between palace offices. He remembered their first real conversation because she had refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. His father had still been king, and Ethan had spent an entire afternoon arguing for a new winter supply route. Every advisor had praised his proposal. Claire had quietly delivered. A report showing 3 mountain villages would be cut off whenever heavy snow closed the northern pass. "You think my plan is wrong?" Ethan had asked. Claire had looked startled that the prince was speaking directly to her. "I think the people living there probably know the mountain better than the people looking at it on a map." He should have been offended. Instead, he had changed the route. That became the beginning of something neither of them named for years. Claire learned when Ethan needed silence and when silence was the worst thing for him. After his father's death, she found him alone in the royal study, surrounded by condolence letters he could not bring himself to open. She made coffee, sat across from him, and opened the first envelope only after he nodded. When the crown became his, Everyone else started calling him Your Majesty. Claire still asked whether he had eaten lunch. She remembered birthdays he forgot, servants whose children were sick, and villages the council mentioned only when taxes were due. Ethan had come to believe she would always be there because she always had been. A knock sounded behind him. Madeline stood in the doorway wearing a simple dark green dress instead of her ceremonial gown. "The council has been waiting for 40 minutes, she said. Ethan looked back at Claire's note. "They can wait." Madeline entered slowly. Her eyes moved to the pendant in his hand. "She really left. Before sunrise. Do you know where?" Ethan shook his head. Madeline studied the nearly empty room. "Last night, when she said I had done nothing wrong, she was comforting me while her own heart was breaking." Ethan looked at her sharply. "Do not tell me what Claire felt. Then tell me." He opened his mouth and found no answer. Madeline's voice softened. "You cannot, because you never asked her." Ethan looked away. The truth was becoming impossible to avoid. He knew Claire preferred cinnamon in her coffee. He knew she hated formal dances and loved the first snowfall of winter. He knew she kept peppermint candies for frightened children visiting the palace. Yet he did not know where she would go when she needed a life beyond him. The realization hollowed something inside his chest. "I thought she understood," he said. "Perhaps she understood perfectly." Madeline glanced toward the note. Perhaps that is why she left. Another knock came. The elderly night steward stood outside, holding Claire's ring of palace keys. "She returned these at 5:15 this morning, Your Majesty." Ethan stared at the keys. 7 years reduced to a small circle of brass in another man's hand. Did she say anything? Only that she was grateful for the work. The steward hesitated, and that no one should be blamed for letting her leave. Of course she had said that. Even while walking away, Claire had protected someone else from consequences. Ethan looked again at the sentence she had left him. "You made your choice. I am finally making mine." This time he did not read it as punishment. He read it as something far worse. Permission she had finally given herself. By 10 o'clock, Ethan was sitting at the head of the council table with Claire's silver pendant hidden inside his closed hand. Richard Vale stood near the tall windows, speaking calmly about northern trade routes, alpha alliances, and the political stability Madeline's appointment would supposedly guarantee. Every argument sounded familiar because Ethan had repeated most of them to himself for weeks. 3 weeks earlier, Richard had placed a map across this same table and pointed to 5 territories whose leaders were threatening to reconsider their agreements with Blackwood. "They need certainty," Richard had said. "They need a Luna whose bloodline carries influence." Ethan had immediately understood what the council was asking. Claire is an Omega. Richard had not bothered denying the implication. Miss Bennet may be admirable, but admiration does not secure borders or trade. Ethan remembered the anger that had risen inside him. He had wanted to defend her, yet somewhere between anger and responsibility, he had accepted the council's premise that Claire needed protecting from the consequences of being chosen. Madeline Hayes offered the alliance they wanted. Her family had generations of political influence and relationships throughout the Northern Territories. Ethan told himself the arrangement would be temporary. He told himself a title could not change what existed between him and Claire. That evening, he found Claire alone in the palace library sorting community petitions. "The council wants Madeline Hayes named Luna," he said. Claire's hands stopped over the papers. "And what do you want?" "I want the kingdom stable." "That was not my question." Ethan remembered looking away. Claire waited. She always gave him time to find the truth. "If I refuse, several houses may withdraw their support. Then what happens? Trade becomes uncertain. Smaller packs suffer first." Claire nodded slowly. "So you are going to accept?" "For now." She looked down at the petition beneath her hand. "Where does that leave me?" Ethan crossed the room and reached for her fingers. "Nothing between us has to change." Claire pulled her hand back. He had noticed the movement, but he had not understood it. "You will announce another woman as Luna," she said. "It is a political title. To you, perhaps. Claire, I am trying to protect you from becoming the target of every alpha house that thinks an Omega has no place beside the throne." Her eyes lifted to his. "Did I ask you to protect me that way?" Ethan had no answer then. He had one now, sitting inside the council chamber with her pendant cutting into his palm. No, she had never asked him to hide her. She had never asked him to decide which humiliation she could endure. He had simply chosen for both of them and called it sacrifice. "Your Majesty?" Richard's voice pulled him back to the present. The council requires your approval on the final Luna provisions. Ethan looked across the table at Madeline. She sat perfectly still, but her expression held none of the triumph Richard seemed to expect. Before I approve anything, Ethan said, I want every document related to the Luna negotiations from the last 6 months. Richard frowned. That will delay matters unnecessarily. Then they will be delayed. The northern houses expect certainty today. Ethan opened his hand beneath the table and looked at Claire's pendant. They expected certainty from me yesterday too. Madeline's gaze sharpened. Richard lowered his voice. This is about Miss Bennet. No, Ethan said. This is about a king discovering how many decisions were made because everyone assumed an Omega's wishes mattered less than an alliance. Silence settled across the chamber. Richard's face remained composed, but something colder appeared behind his eyes. Careful, Your Majesty. One woman's departure should not determine the future of a kingdom. Ethan stood. You are right. He slipped the pendant into his coat. But perhaps her departure finally showed me what has been determining it for far too long. Madeline found Ethan in the royal library less than an hour after the council meeting ended. He stood beside a long table covered with 6 months of agreements, letters, and draft provisions, reading every page Richard Vale had insisted was necessary for the kingdom. You are looking in the wrong place, she said. Ethan raised his eyes. Meaning? Madeline walked to the table and placed a sealed copy of the Luna Covenant beside his hand. You are searching for proof that the council manipulated you. They did. But that does not make your decision theirs. Ethan stared at her. I know. Do you? Her voice was calm rather than accusing. Because if you find something dishonest in those papers, you might decide Claire left because Richard pushed too hard. That would be convenient. Ethan slowly closed the document. Then tell me what I am missing. Madeline drew a quiet breath. Last night, she opened the covenant. You brought me into the royal suite because tradition required the final agreement to be signed there after the Luna announcement. 2 council witnesses joined us through the adjoining chamber. We reviewed these terms for nearly 2 hours. Nothing romantic happened. We were discussing trade routes, representation, and the conditions of my appointment. Ethan's jaw tightened. Claire does not know that. Perhaps not. But if you think explaining it will repair everything, you still do not understand why she left. Ethan looked toward the rain-darkened windows. She saw me take another woman through a door I once told her would always be hers. Exactly. Madeline stepped closer to the table. The problem was not what happened after the door closed. The problem was everything you decided before you reached it. Ethan said nothing. Madeline continued. I met Claire only a few times before yesterday. Do you know what she did the morning the council announced I was coming? No. She sent flowers to my rooms with a note welcoming me to Blackwood Palace. Ethan looked at her. She knew why you were here. Yes, and she still worried that I might feel alone. Madeline's expression softened. Last night, while she was watching the man she loved walk away with someone else, she told me I had done nothing wrong. That should tell you something about the woman you expected to accept this quietly. A knock interrupted them. An elderly palace clerk entered carrying 2 wooden boxes filled with folders. Your Majesty, these belong to Miss Bennet. We were told the community office needs instructions regarding her unfinished cases. Ethan frowned. What cases? The clerk opened the first box. Inside were dozens of letters organized by district. Housing requests, employment appeals, winter supply applications, notes from elderly betas and omegas whose petitions had never reached the Royal Council. Ethan picked up one file. Claire's handwriting filled the margins. Family needs temporary housing before first snow. Please review urgently. Another contained a thank you letter from a widowed Omega whose daughter had received medicine through a palace assistance fund. Another came from a carpenter Claire had helped find work after his pack closed its workshop. Ethan looked at the clerk. How many people was she helping? I could not say exactly, sir. Hundreds. The man hesitated. Possibly more. Ethan felt something inside him shift. For years, Claire had asked him to sign community approvals. He remembered signing them between meetings, trusting her summaries, never once asking how she knew which people needed help. Madeline lifted another letter. You thought she lived in the shadow of your kingdom. Ethan looked across the boxes of names. She was carrying part of it. Before he could answer, a small voice came from the library. Doorway. A young Omega girl stood beside her mother, holding a folded letter against her chest. The mother looked embarrassed. Forgive us, Your Majesty. We came to see Miss Bennet. Ethan's voice softened. Claire is not here. The girl's hopeful expression faded, but she said she would listen. Ethan looked at the letter in her hands, then at the hundreds waiting on the table. For the first time, he understood that Claire's empty room was not the only place her absence could be felt. The girl looked up at him and asked the question no council report ever had. Who will listen to us now? I will. Ethan's answer to the little Omega girl came before any advisor could speak for him. He crossed the library slowly and lowered himself enough that she no longer had to look toward the ceiling to meet his eyes. If Claire promised someone would listen, then someone will listen. The girl glanced at her mother before offering him the folded letter. Ethan accepted it with both hands. Her name was Lily Morgan. She was 9 years old, and her mother had been trying for 4 months to transfer to affordable housing closer to her work at the Palace Laundry. Claire had already written 3 notes beside their application. Ethan read every one. Your request will be reviewed today, he said. Lily studied him with the serious expression children sometimes wore when adults had disappointed them too often. Claire always said that too. Ethan felt the truth of it. Then I should make sure her words still mean something. After Lily and her mother left, Ethan returned to the table. He did not touch the Luna documents again. Instead, he opened Claire's first box of community files and began reading. By sunset, he had discovered patterns no royal report had ever shown him. Omegas waited longer for housing reviews. Betas from smaller packs struggled to get employment petitions before the council. Elderly residents living more than 50 miles from Blackwood Palace often abandoned requests because traveling to the capital cost more than they could afford. Claire had quietly created her own network of palace clerks, local volunteers, and community workers to move those requests forward. She had never called it reform. She had simply noticed people falling through gaps and refused to leave them there. Richard Vale arrived shortly before dinner. Your Majesty, the Northern delegation is requesting confirmation of Lady Hayes's status. Ethan continued reading. They will have an answer tomorrow. Richard's gaze moved across Claire's files. This is administrative work. Surely palace staff can handle it. Ethan looked up. Then why did one Omega have to build an unofficial system to make sure citizens were heard? Richard's expression remained controlled. Every kingdom has imperfect procedures. Imperfection becomes a choice when everyone knows about it, and no one changes it. Madeline stood near the fireplace, silent until then. She removed the silver Luna insignia from her collar and placed it beside the unopened covenant. There is your answer for the Northern delegation. Richard stared at her. Lady Hayes. I agreed to strengthen an alliance, Madeline said. I did not agree to become evidence that an alpha bloodline matters more than mutual choice. Your family approved this arrangement. My family does not choose my life either. Ethan looked at her, understanding immediately what she was doing. Richard turned toward him. If you allow this, the council will assume Miss Bennet's departure has compromised your judgment. Ethan stood. Claire's departure corrected my attention. He gathered several files and placed them before Richard. Tomorrow we begin establishing community representatives from every rank. 6 districts first. If the system works, we expand it across the kingdom. Richard's eyes narrowed. And the Luna position? No new candidate. The throne requires stability. Then we will build stability without deciding who a woman must become for political convenience. Richard left without another word. Madeline watched the doors close behind him. You realize he will fight every change. Then he can argue in council. Ethan returned to Claire's files. Near the bottom of the second box, he found a worn folder marked Willow Creek. Inside were letters from a small community nearly 200 miles west of the capital. They offered temporary housing, work, and support to Omegas who had left packs where they no longer felt welcome. Claire had exchanged letters with them for almost 3 years. One sentence in her handwriting stopped him. If I ever needed to begin again, I think I would begin here. Ethan stared at the words. Madeline noticed the change in his face. You know where she is. I know where she might be. Are you going tonight? Ethan slowly closed the folder. Every instinct told him to leave immediately, to cross the distance, and ask Claire to come home. But that was the man she had walked away from. The man who acted first and called his intentions protection. No, he said. Not yet. Madeline studied him. Why? Ethan looked across the hundreds of letters Claire had spent years answering. Because if I go to her before I start changing what made her leave, then I am only asking her to trust another promise. For the next 6 days, Ethan did not search for Claire. Every morning, the Alpha King entered the council chamber before sunrise, and every evening, he left carrying another stack of petitions that had once been considered too minor for royal attention. Richard Vale challenged nearly every proposal. Ethan listened to each objection, answered it without anger, and kept moving forward. The first 6 districts received community representatives chosen from Alpha, Beta, and Omega residents. A direct petition office was established at Blackwood Palace, so rank could no longer determine whether a request reached the council. Ethan also ordered a formal review of the rules surrounding the Luna position. A Luna cannot be a condition attached to a trade agreement, he told the council. Richard leaned back in his chair. Tradition has preserved alliances for generations. Then alliances should be strong enough to survive without deciding a woman's future for her. Madeline sat across the table without the silver insignia she had worn only days earlier. Her family's trade agreement remained under negotiation, but she had made her position clear. She would support the kingdom as an Alpha representative. She would not remain Luna simply because powerful. Families preferred the arrangement. On the 7th morning, Ethan received the first report from the new petition office. Lily Morgan and her mother had been approved for housing less than a mile from the palace laundry. Ethan read the notice twice before placing it beside Claire's silver pendant. It was not enough. He knew that. One corrected case could not repair years of neglect, and 1 week of better decisions could not make him a different man. But for the first time, he was beginning something without expecting Claire to reward him for it. That afternoon, Ethan left Blackwood Palace in a plain dark coat with 1 horse, a small travel bag, and no royal procession. 1 guard followed several miles behind because palace protocol would not allow the king to travel entirely alone. Willow Creek lay nearly 200 miles west, beyond farming towns, forest roads, and the foothills that marked the edge of Blackwood territory. Ethan traveled steadily, stopping each evening rather than exhausting his horse. Along the way, he passed communities Claire had written about in her files. At a roadside market, an elderly Beta recognized the name Claire Bennett when Ethan casually asked whether she had traveled through. "Kind young woman," the man said. "Helped my neighbor fill out a housing appeal last winter." Ethan thanked him and continued west. By the 4th evening, he no longer needed the folder to guide him. Claire had left traces everywhere, not through power or titles, but through people who remembered being treated as though they mattered. On the 5th afternoon, Willow Creek appeared between tall pines beneath a pale autumn sky. It was smaller than Ethan expected. Wooden cottages surrounded a community building beside a narrow creek, and children carried boxes of donated books through an open doorway. Then he saw her. Claire stood outside wearing a simple blue dress beneath a gray coat, helping an elderly Omega organize winter supplies. Her hair was loosely tied back. She looked tired, but there was a calmness in her face Ethan had not seen inside Blackwood Palace for years. He stopped 20 feet away. Claire turned. The box in her hands became perfectly still. Neither of them spoke. Ethan removed his travel bag from his shoulder and placed it on the ground. He did not move closer. Claire handed the box to the older woman, who quietly carried it inside. Then she faced him fully. "Did you come all this way to take me back?" Ethan felt every answer he had rehearsed disappear. He looked at the woman he loved and finally understood that love did not give him ownership of her next decision. "No," he said softly. Claire's guarded expression did not change. Ethan drew a slow breath. "I came to tell you that you were right to leave." Claire did not answer immediately. A cool wind moved through the pines behind Willow Creek, carrying the scent of fallen leaves, and would smoke across the narrow road. Ethan remained beside his travel bag, 20 feet away, making no attempt to close the distance. "You crossed nearly 200 miles to tell me I was right?" she finally asked. "No." His voice was quiet. "I crossed nearly 200 miles because I owed you the truth without asking for anything in return." Claire folded her arms loosely. "Then tell me." Ethan looked at her, and for once there was no council chamber, no crown, and no carefully prepared explanation to hide behind. "Nothing happened between Madeline and me that night. The final covenant was signed in the royal suite because tradition required it. Council witnesses were there." Claire's expression barely changed. "Do you think that makes everything better?" "No." The answer came immediately. That surprised her. Ethan continued. For several days, I wanted it to. I wanted your leaving to be a misunderstanding because misunderstandings are easier to repair than choices. Claire's eyes lowered briefly. And now I understand that the closed door was only the last thing you saw. I made the real decision weeks earlier. He paused. I decided you would remain beside me, while another woman carried the title I knew the council would never give you. I called it protection because that sounded better than admitting I never gave you a choice. Claire felt the old ache return, but it no longer controlled her breathing. You told me nothing between us had to change. Ethan nodded. I remember. Do you know what I heard? Tell me. Her gaze met his. I heard that everything could change for you, but I was expected to stay exactly where you left me. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. You were right. No defense followed. No explanation about duty. Claire had prepared herself for arguments. His agreement left her strangely unsteady. Madeline withdrew from the Luna arrangement, he said. The northern negotiations are continuing without it. We started community representation in 6 districts. Alpha, Beta, and Omega residents all have seats. The palace also opened a direct petition office. Claire stared at him. Why are you telling me this? Because those changes should have happened years ago. That was not what I asked. Ethan understood. I am not asking you to reward me for them. Something in Claire's expression softened, but only slightly. 1 week does not change a kingdom. I know, and it does not change 7 years. I know that too. Claire looked toward the community building. Through the windows, several residents were arranging donated books and winter coats. I have work here now. Then stay. She turned back sharply. What? Stay in Willow Creek. Ethan's voice remained steady despite the pain behind it. Build whatever you came here to build. Be whoever you want to be when no one is deciding for you. Claire searched his face. And you? I go back tomorrow. You are not going to ask me to return? Ethan shook his head. If I came here only to bring you home, then I learned nothing. The silence between them changed. It was not forgiveness. It was not reunion. But for the first time in years, Claire felt no invisible expectation waiting behind Ethan's words. He reached into his coat and removed the silver moon pendant. Walking only as far as a wooden fence between them, he placed it carefully on the post. This belongs to you. Claire looked at it. You gave it to me, and you returned it when it represented a promise I failed to keep. He stepped back. Keep it, leave it there, or forget it existed. That decision is yours. Ethan picked up his travel bag and turned toward the small guest house near the creek. Ethan. He stopped but did not approach. Claire looked at the pendant glowing softly beneath the autumn light. The guest house serves dinner at 7. Hope crossed his face before he could hide it. Claire raised her chin. Dinner is not forgiveness. Ethan nodded. I would never call it that. Claire waited until he walked away before touching the pendant. For the first time since leaving Blackwood Palace, she allowed herself to wonder whether the man she had loved was finally learning that holding on and loving someone were not always the same thing. Ethan left Willow Creek the next morning exactly as he had promised. Claire watched from the community house as he secured his travel bag to the saddle, thanked the guest house owner, and started east without asking her for another answer. He never looked back. Somehow that mattered. The silver moon pendant remained in Claire's pocket for 3 days before she finally placed it around her neck. She told herself it was only a piece of her own history, not a promise renewed. Then autumn faded into winter, and distance began revealing what words could not. Ethan sent no personal letters. He made no public declarations about winning Claire back. Instead, news arrived through people who had no reason to protect his feelings. A Beta carpenter from North Ridge wrote that his district had elected its first community representative. An Omega mother Claire once helped send a letter saying her housing appeal had been reviewed in 12 days instead of 4 months. Another message reported that the palace petition office now accepted requests by mail, so families living hundreds of miles from the capital did not have to travel to Blackwood Palace merely to be heard. Claire read every letter twice. Still, she remained in Willow Creek. She helped turn an abandoned meeting hall into a community center, organized winter supplies, and created a small desk where residents could receive help with employment and housing applications. Ethan's reforms belonged to the kingdom. Her life belonged to her. 2 months after his visit, Madeline Hayes arrived beneath a gray winter sky. Claire found her carrying her own travel case toward the community house. Please tell me the Alpha King did not send you, Claire said. Madeline smiled. He specifically does not know I am here. Over hot coffee, Madeline described the resistance inside the council. Richard Vale had challenged nearly every reform. Ethan had answered him through votes, revised procedures, and public records rather than royal intimidation. The 6 pilot districts had become 12. More were scheduled for spring. And the Luna arrangement? Claire asked. Madeline set down her cup. Gone. Temporarily? Permanently, if Ethan gets the final charter approved. Claire became still. Madeline continued. The proposed law says no Luna appointment can be required by a political, territorial, or trade agreement. Any future Luna must accept the position freely. Claire looked toward the window. Snow rested lightly on the pine branches outside. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know what changed after you left. Did Ethan ask you to say that? No. Madeline's expression softened. That is the point. Another 3 months passed. The charter became law. Community representation expanded again. Ethan still did not write. Then, in early spring, Willow Creek received an official invitation to send a representative to Blackwood Palace for the kingdom's first open council session. The community selected Claire unanimously. She stared at the letter for a long time. You can refuse, the elderly Omega beside her reminded her. Claire smiled faintly. I know. 5 days later, a carriage carried her east through green foothills and familiar towns. When Blackwood Palace appeared beyond the trees, Claire felt the old ache return, but it no longer felt like fear. She entered through the main doors, not the servants' gate. Her name appeared on the council register beside Willow Creek. Ethan was waiting across the entrance hall. He wore the same black royal coat she remembered, but he did not approach until she looked directly at him. His eyes dropped briefly to the silver pendant at her throat, and something warm flickered across his face. Welcome, Miss Bennet, he said formally. Claire understood. Immediately. Here, before the palace and the council, he would not define her by what she had once been to him. She was here because Willow Creek had chosen her. Thank you, Your Majesty. Ethan stepped aside and left the path before her completely open. Claire walked toward the council chamber under her own name, carrying her community's petitions in her hands. Behind her, Ethan followed at a respectful distance, and she realized that the first true proof of his change was not that he had finally learned how to lead a kingdom. It was that he had finally learned how to walk beside a woman without choosing her direction. The open council session lasted nearly 4 hours, and Claire spoke more than anyone in Blackwood Palace had ever allowed her to speak before. She presented Willow Creek's housing proposals, requested permanent funding for community petition offices, and challenged a transportation rule that made assistance difficult for families living far from major towns. Ethan listened without interrupting. When council members questioned her recommendations, he let Claire answer for herself. Richard Vale resisted several proposals, but even he could no longer dismiss the representatives now seated around the table. When the session ended, Claire gathered her papers and stepped into the corridor. Ethan waited near the western windows. Would you walk with me? He asked. Claire nodded. They moved through the palace until they reached the royal corridor, and Claire suddenly stopped. Ahead stood the same carved door she had faced months earlier. The same door Ethan had closed after telling her nothing between them had to change. He noticed where she was looking. I almost had it removed, he said. Claire glanced at him. Why did you not? Because the door was never responsible for what happened. Ethan walked toward it and opened it, then stepped away. The quiet room beyond was empty. Claire touched the moon pendant at her throat. Ethan looked at it, but did not smile as though its return belonged to him. That night, I thought being king meant carrying every difficult choice myself, he said. What I actually did was make your choice for you. Claire remained silent. I cannot undo that, he continued. And I will not ask you to forget it, because I finally learned something I should have understood years ago. Claire looked through the open doorway. What happens now? Ethan met her eyes. You return to Willow Creek if that is where you want to be. You remain its representative for as long as they choose you. You disagree with me in council whenever you believe I am wrong. A faint smile touched Claire's lips. That could happen often. I am beginning to expect it. Her smile grew. Then Ethan's expression became serious again. And if there is still a place in your life for me, I would like the chance to earn it without asking you to become smaller, so I can remain comfortable. Claire felt months of memory pass through her at once. The servants' gate before dawn, Willow Creek beneath autumn leaves, Ethan standing 20 feet away and refusing to command her home, Madeline arriving with news he had never asked her to deliver, and the council chamber where an Omega's voice had finally carried as far as an Alpha King's. "I will not return to what we had," Claire said. Pain flickered across Ethan's face, but he nodded. "I understand." Claire stepped closer. "Good. Because I am willing to find out what we could have instead." Ethan stared at her, hope arriving slowly. He extended one hand and stopped halfway between them. Claire looked at it. Then she chose to close the distance herself. Months followed, not with grand promises, but with ordinary proof. Claire continued representing Willow Creek. Ethan continued the reforms whether she agreed with him or challenged him. They rebuilt trust through difficult conversations, quiet dinners, long walks, and the freedom to say no without fearing what it would cost. When Claire eventually accepted the title of Luna, no council selected her, no alliance required her, and no bloodline determined her worth. Before the kingdom recognized them together, Ethan stood beside the same royal doorway and asked one final question. "Still your choice?" Claire looked at the door behind him. It remained open. She placed her hand in his. Every day, and this time, when they walked forward together, no door closed behind them. If Claire and Ethan's journey reminded you that real love requires respect, freedom, and the courage to change, please like this video, share it with someone who believes second chances must be earned, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of love, destiny, and redemption.